Russian-linked hackers found a hidden flaw in Windows and exploited it for roughly 5 months before anyone at Microsoft issued a fix. During that entire window, hundreds of thousands of Windows machines across the world were sitting open with any warnings, patches, or defenses. The vulnerability has a formal ID CVE 2024-43451, and it was patched by Microsoft recently. Security researchers have documented how it worked, who used it, and what they stole. Every piece of software has flaws. That is not controversial. It is simply the nature of writing millions of lines of code. Most flaws are caught before they are ever exploited. But some are not. When attackers find a flaw before the software maker does, it is called a zero-day. The name refers to the number of days the software maker has had to fix it, 0. And a 0-day in the hands of a sophisticated state-linked hacking group is one of the most dangerous things in cybersecurity. CVE 2024-43451 was exactly that kind of flaw. It lived inside every supported version of Microsoft Windows, Windows 10, Windows 11, and Windows Server going back to 2008. That is an enormous surface area. Virtually every corporate network, government department, and institutional environment running Windows was, in theory, vulnerable. What made this particular flaw especially alarming was how little a victim needed to do to trigger it. Most people assume that getting hacked requires opening a suspicious attachment or clicking an obviously bad link. Not here. With this vulnerability, all an attacker needed was for you to interact with a specially crafted file in the most routine ways imaginable. A single right click, dragging the file to another folder, or even trying to delete it. That was enough. The moment you did any of those things, your machine silently reached out to an attacker-controlled server and handed over a critical piece of your authentication credentials. To understand why that is so serious, you need to understand what it was actually stealing. Windows networks use an authentication protocol called NTLM, NTLAN Manager, which has been part of the Windows ecosystem for decades. When you log into a Windows machine, your password is not stored as plain text anywhere on your computer. Instead, it is transformed into a mathematical fingerprint called a hash. On modern systems, this is specifically called an NTLM v2 hash. Here is the problem. Attackers do not need your actual password. They just need the hash. There's a well-documented technique in cybersecurity called a pass-the-hash attack. Once an attacker captures your NTLM v2 hash, they can use it directly to authenticate to other systems on your network, without ever needing to know or crack the underlying password. They simply present the hash wherever a password would normally go, and the system lets them in. Think about what that means in practice. An attacker captures your hash from one machine. Now they can potentially move sideways across your entire network, from workstation to workstation, into file servers, databases, internal tools, anywhere that trusts the same credentials. In enterprise environments, this lateral movement is often how a single compromised endpoint turns into a catastrophic full network breach. CVE 2024-43451 was a machine for doing exactly this at scale, with minimal friction for the attacker and minimal awareness from the victim. The Israeli cybersecurity firm Clear Sky Cybersecurity was the first to piece together how this attack unfolded. What they found was a carefully constructed operation, not a crude smash and grab. The attackers started by compromising a legitimate Ukrainian government server, specifically one belonging to the education department of a regional city council. They used that compromised server as their launchpad because emails sent from a real government domain are far more convincing than emails sent from a random unknown source. From that server, they sent targeted phishing emails to specific individuals. The emails were precise. They told recipients that their academic certificate was expiring and that they needed to renew it through an attached link. It is worth pausing on how well-crafted this is. Academic certificate renewals are routine. The email came from a real government domain. There was nothing obviously alarming about it. When the recipient clicked the link, a zip file downloaded. Inside the zip were two files, a decoy PDF designed to look like a legitimate graduation diploma, and a URL file, essentially a Windows internet shortcut. The PDF was there purely to calm suspicion. If you opened what looked like an official diploma document, you might assume everything was fine. But the URL file was the weapon, and you did not even need to open it. A right click to inspect it, an attempt to move it, an effort to delete it because it looked like clutter. Any of those actions silently triggered communication from your machine to the attacker's server over the SMB protocol, a file sharing protocol that Windows uses routinely and that many network monitoring tools underwatch. Your NTLM v2 hash went with it. From there, the attackers had what they needed to authenticate as you. Researchers also observed that the attack chain continued further, with additional malware being downloaded, specifically an open-source remote access tool called SparkRat, which gave the attackers persistent remote control over infected systems. Clear Sky found the first evidence of this campaign being used in the wild in June 2024. Microsoft did not patch it until November 12, 2024. That is roughly 5 months during which this attack was active and unaddressed. The group responsible for deploying this exploit has been tracked by Ukraine's Computer Emergency Response Team, CRTUA, under the identifier UAC 0194, and they are suspected to be Russian. The targeting pattern is consistent with what security researchers have come to expect from Russian state-aligned operations: a focus on Ukrainian institutions, government workers, academics, and anyone connected to Ukraine's administrative and military infrastructure. This is not an isolated actor. The attack sits within a broader, well-documented pattern of Russian cyber operations that have run in parallel with the physical conflict in Ukraine since 2022. Cyber tools are used for intelligence collection, credential theft, network infiltration, and in some cases, preparation for more disruptive attacks later. The data exfiltrated in operations like this one feeds into decisions made at the strategic level. What makes this attack worth understanding beyond the geopolitical context is the toolkit it used. The NTLM v2 hash theft technique it exploited was not new. It was the third such vulnerability in 2024 alone that targeted the same type of authentication credential. Attackers had clearly identified NTLM hash disclosure as a reliable and repeatable path into Windows environments, and they were returning to it consistently. While CVE 2024 43451 required at least a minimal interaction with a file, a second Russian-linked operation discovered in late 2024 required nothing whatsoever from its victims. Not a click, not a download, not an interaction of any kind. This operation was carried out by a group known as Romcom, tracked under various names including Storm 0978 and Tropical Scorpius, a Russia-aligned group that operates across both espionage and cybercrime. Romcom is believed to work in alignment with Russian intelligence interests, and in 2024, their targets included government entities in Europe, defense and energy sectors in Ukraine, pharmaceutical and insurance companies in the United States, and legal sector organizations in Germany. What made their late 2024 campaign exceptional and deeply alarming to the security community was their use of what researchers call a zero-click exploit chain. They chained together two separate zero-day vulnerabilities, one in Mozilla Firefox and one in Windows, to create an attack that triggered automatically the moment a victim loaded a web page. No interaction needed. Just opening a browser and visiting the wrong site was enough. The Firefox vulnerability, formally designated CVE 2024-9680, was a critical flaw in the browser's animation timeline feature. It received a severity score of 9.8 out of 10, essentially the highest level of risk in practical terms. When a victim visited a page hosting the exploit, the flaw caused code to execute silently inside the browser's content process. But browser sandboxes exist specifically to contain this kind of code execution. A properly sandboxed exploit cannot easily reach the rest of your operating system. So Romcom did not stop there. They paired the Firefox flaw with a second zero-day in Windows, CVE 2024-49039, a privilege escalation vulnerability in the Windows Task Scheduler. That flaw let their code break out of the Firefox sandbox entirely and execute at a higher privilege level on the underlying Windows system. The result was that a malicious library was loaded using an undocumented remote procedure call mechanism to launch a hidden PowerShell process, which then reached out to a command and control server and downloaded the ROMcom backdoor. Once that backdoor was installed, the attackers had broad, persistent access to the victim's machine. They could execute commands, exfiltrate data, and load additional tools at will. ESET researchers who discovered and documented this campaign found evidence of it running from October 10th through November 4th, 2024. Mozilla patched the Firefox vulnerability within 1 day of being notified. Microsoft took until November 12th to patch the Windows Task Scheduler flaw. During that gap, the attack chain remained fully operational. ESET's telemetry showed that potential victims who accessed exploit hosting sites were located predominantly in Europe and North America. The number of affected individuals varied, but in some countries, as many as 250 people were targeted in this single campaign. These two operations were not anomalies. They fit into a well-established and accelerating pattern. According to security research compiled for 2024, Microsoft reported more than 1,300 vulnerabilities across its products that year, an increase from the year before. While the number of vulnerabilities rated as critical declined, the attacks themselves became more sophisticated. Attackers in 2024 increasingly focused on identity and privilege escalation as entry points, rather than simply crashing systems or corrupting files. The goal was persistent, quiet access, the kind that lets them stay inside networks for months. Zero-day vulnerabilities are particularly dangerous because, by definition, there is no defense available when they are first used. You cannot patch against a vulnerability that has no patch. You cannot configure your antivirus to detect a threat that has no known signature. The only protection in those windows of active exploitation is behavioral detection. Noticing that something on your network is doing something it should not be doing, and that requires both sophisticated tooling and human attention that most organizations do not consistently apply. Russia is not the only country running operations like these, but Russian state-aligned groups have been among the most active and consistent operators in this space, and the events of 2024 demonstrated that they had the capability to find, weaponize, and deploy zero-day exploits at scale for months without being stopped. It is easy to hear about attacks targeting Ukrainian government workers or European defense sector organizations and conclude that this is someone else's problem. But there are several reasons why that conclusion is wrong. First, collateral exposure is real. When Russian-linked groups run infrastructure for these operations, compromised servers, exploit hosting domains, malware distribution networks, those same tools are sometimes repurposed for broader cybercriminal activity. The line between state-sponsored espionage and financially motivated cybercrime is not clean. Several of the groups involved in these operations, including ROMcom, run ransomware and extortion operations alongside their espionage work. Second, the techniques and vulnerabilities exposed in these campaigns do not stay secret. Once a zero-day becomes publicly known, other threat actors study it. Criminal groups with no geopolitical motivation will take note of a reliable technique for stealing NTLM-v2 hashes and apply it in their own campaigns. CVE 2024-43451 was the third such NTLM targeting vulnerability in 2024. That tells you there's an active, sustained interest in this attack method across the threat landscape, not just among state actors. Third, your organization's exposure matters even if you are not a target. If you work somewhere that uses Windows, a business, a hospital, a law firm, a school, and that organization does not apply patches promptly, the same vulnerability that was used to target Ukrainian academics in June 2024 was technically usable against your systems too, until November 2024 when the patch arrived. That is 5 months of exposure, and patch delays are common. This is the part that matters most practically. Apply updates? This sounds obvious, but it is consistently the single most impactful thing individual users and organizations can do. For organizations, restricting outbound SMB traffic to the internet is a concrete mitigation that would have blocked the credential theft mechanism in CVE 2024-43451 entirely. Keep your browsers updated. The ROMcom campaign exploited Firefox before a patch existed, but within a single day of Mozilla being notified, A fix was available. Think carefully about unexpected file interactions. The CVE 2024-43451 attack used a file that was designed to look innocuous, disguised as an academic certificate, hosted on a real government server arriving in a plausible email context. For organizations managing Windows environments, and monitoring for unusual outbound SMB connections and unusual authentication events can surface lateral movement before it becomes a full breach. What happened with CVE 2024-43451 and the Romcom zero-click campaign is a precise illustration of how modern state-linked cyber operations work. They find vulnerabilities that defenders do not know exist. The gap between when Russian-linked attackers first used CVE 2024-43451 and when Microsoft patched it was not 5 months of Microsoft negligence. Microsoft could not patch a vulnerability it did not know about. It was 5 months during which a foreign adversary had a capability that no defense could fully answer.